Okay, folks, how you doing? It's the 4th of November. This is lecture number 11, afternoon group on participation. Okay. Again, not very good projector in this room. Sorry about that. Today I'm talking about a person called David Graeber. Not just talking about him, but this is the week that I usually, well, in the two versions of this course I've done before, usually talk about David Graeber. We do with them off now, right? And David Graeber was an anthropologist. It's a lottery. Yes, choose the right one. David Graeber is an anthropologist who I used to work with, he was a friend, but he died from COVID 8 weeks ago. He passed away 8 weeks ago from COVID. Yeah, he was very young. Well, I think he was very young because he was just 3 or 4 days older than me. And in previous weeks, in previous versions of this course, we talked mainly about his book, Direct Action, which I hope you've been reading. I'm a bit concerned some of you weren't reading. But that really is about participatory anthropology, a kind of activist anthropology, or I don't want to say anarchist anthropology, but part of the effort, I think, to rethink what anthropology could be. And I think it was really a necessary effort, and I want to try and explain why it was necessary and whether or not what is offered with the workplace inquiry model, autonomous anthropology, and this attempt to relocate the anthropological gaze, whether or not that was successful, or whether or not that can be successful. So a few things to explain. One, the workplace inquiry method. You might have come across this before. I talk about it in the Culture in the World course. Workplace inquiry owes its origins to Karl Marx, who at the very end of his life did a survey of workers in factories, where he had 100 questions. He sent out to 1,000 different places for 1,000 workers. No. Bring him back now. Should have charged. 100 dong. No. Một trăm nghìn dong. Yeah, yes. I'm joking with you. Don't forget to bring them back. Debt. They owe a debt. That'll be relevant. The workplace inquiry model. I want you to remember this one. Workplace inquiry is a style of doing research that has been adopted by left-wing groups, I guess, inspired by Marx sending out 100 questions to workers, but has been adapted by the Italian autonomous tradition and by various other groupings, and is used today quite often in research by activist groups They want to break with the conventions of the anthropological gaze, which means the one person staring at other people and writing books about them. The anthropological gaze is staring, right? Is gazing at a people and then writing a book about them. Workplace inquiry tries to do something more democratic, let's say, to break from that anthropological gaze and from the institutional control of knowledge. So that's what's autonomous about it. That the institutions will no longer necessarily have a say in how knowledge is produced. Unfortunately, I don't think we escaped that last part very well. So the idea is to recognize that doing ethnography is a political practice, and it always has been. I've said this over and over. Malinowski arrived with the police, for example. And anthropology has so often been about war, basically. Evans Pritchard and war, or more or less war or anti-war. The importance of Vietnam and the American war for the ethics debate is another example. But even other anthropologists, Clifford Geertz, for example, in the Cold War. War is a framing context for talking about ethnography. And to understand what is going on here, we have to see that war is not always only military. Political wars can be ideological, have ideological dimensions, and they can arise in the context of industrial disputes or other struggles. Yeah. How at week 11 are they getting extra numbers? They didn't have to do this last week or previously. How at week 11? Must be getting close to exam time. So we're talking about ethnography as political practice and where it comes from. And in the context of thinking about anthropologists and war, the question that started to get asked, the important question to ask is, what is the role of the anthropologist in terms of like the tradition of being an advocate for a group of people? You know what I mean by advocate? All right? If you're an advocate, that means you support and in fact vocal, give voice to a group. I'm the advocate for, I don't know what I am the advocate for, the Naxalites in Calcutta. It means I will speak in ways that support their project. If you are an advocate for, I don't know, Heinz baked beans, that means you speak favorably about baked beans. You can be an advocate for anything. It means you speak on behalf of that or for that. Anthropologists can be advocates for their people they study. Here are the Nuer. Evans Pritchard is their spokesperson, or the Trobrianders, or something like this. Okay, but what if you disagree with the people you study? What if you can't support what they are doing? What if, for example, your study is of people you think are not doing a good thing? You might be studying skinheads, youth, racist youth. You might be studying, as an anthropologist, you might be studying, I don't know, well, in the context of war, you might be studying a military group. Think about this, ask yourself, if you were studying the US election campaign of Donald Trump. You want to know the score, the result right now? Okay, right now it's Biden, 223, and Trump. One, 174. What if you were studying the Trump campaign as an anthropologist and you didn't like Trump's policies? Do you have to be an advocate in support? I mean, when you study a tribal group or ethnic group or a minority, you kind of, I can understand you write in favor of them. But what if you are studying races? You can't write in favor of them, surely. What if you're studying something like an election campaign of journalists who are lying and cheating and stuff in favor of their candidate? You can't. What if you are, there's a way of doing ethnography that modern anthropologists, some anyway, started to do that was very much involved in the war effort or embedded in the military. In the Iraq War, started 2003, there was a thing where journalists and some anthropologists actually were embedded in military troops, in teams of the military that went out to fight the Iraqis. This was an example of going to have a look for yourself, right? But they were embedded. Which is an interesting word as well. Embedded, to put in bed with, or in bed with the military, but they were embedded like planted in a flower bed. Right? It's what embedded comes from this. You put flowers in a bed of dirt to be embedded inside the military. So the idea was the journalists or the anthropologists would be inside the Humvee or the tank with the military and travel with them, and they would then be able to have a look for themselves what war was like. Some journalists did this in Vietnam as well, right? They would travel with the troop to the front line in the Humvee, and they would be able to see what it was really like. To have a look for themselves, not just rely on from the military and so on. Of course, this was a kind of public relations thing on behalf of the US military to allow the journalists access. And they wrote fairly favorable pieces about these young men who are, defending freedom and freedom fries, and fighting against the terrors of Islam. And they were just young kids and they were scared like anyone else. So these sort of stories. But this would be a kind of anthropology that's been heavily criticized and questioned because of the other side that anthropology takes up, which is the anti-war critique against the Afghan war or the war in Syria, or back in the day against Vietnam. So the transformation of anthropology that has been going on entails the end of that kind of heroic field worker that goes and defends and is an advocate of a tribal group, because ethically that's problematic. It's problematic for a couple of reasons. Now, it's interesting that the critique of the representation of others by the anthropological gaze, right, the critique of the way in which anthropologists stared at people and wrote books about them, their controlling mode of knowledge, happened at the same time as the unfolding of independence movements that made it more difficult for anthropologists to go into the fieldwork in third world countries, because they were no longer the colonial power that made it possible, that smoothed the way. Right? So at the same time that anthropology started to look for new ways to do things, it had to look for new ways to do things. It was forced to look for new ways to do things because the context of going simply to having the power to and the privilege to go and simply study other people had been taken from them. That privilege was unprivileged, so to speak. So anthropology kind of became unstuck because of the anti-racist campaigns and anti-colonial campaigns that criticized what anthropology was doing, and that anthropology's easy access to those kinds of fieldwork sites became more difficult. Right? So how could an anthropologist work in Vietnam when the Vietnamese were no longer colonized by a power that allowed anthropology to have freedom of access? This, you can't see very well, the red, unfortunately. The red of this book is David Graeber's most famous book. It's very red on my machine, but it hasn't come up red on that projector. But this is his book, Debt, the Last 5,000 Years. 5,000 years? How can that be anthropology? Thank you. Why is that there? Better? So yeah, this red book, this projector is really dying. It doesn't show that at all. Is his book Debt, but in a way, Debt was an example of an anthropologist trying to think of a different way of doing anthropology, ethnography. As some people maybe a little less than generously said, it was 5,000 years of anecdotes. It's still the anthropologist talking to people, saying, what do you think about this? But he's followed a theme rather than a group of people. And that theme is a classic anthropological interest in exchange, in economic relations, give and take. And his argument is fantastic. It's that debt has no logical, no moral, no ethical, there should be no expectation that you would pay back your debt. Please. His argument is very interesting and it's worth taking up, thinking about. The person in international relations, the IMF and so on, when they give loans, they don't do it in the expectation that you'll pay back. They do it to lock you into a relationship, to make sure that you are in a social or economic or political relationship and that you stay in that relationship. So his way of writing in this book is sort of ethnographic, but the topic is very different. And I don't know whether it was successful so much as a way of reinventing anthropology, but it was certainly successful as a book because it sold like huge numbers of copies. Very, very well-selling book, probably the #1 selling anthropology book in the last 15 years. No, easily, I think. Easily. And he made his career. He was able to leave Goldsmiths, where he was in the same university as me, and go to London School of Economics, was where Malinowski used to be. The London School of Economics. Graeber had previously been at Yale University in the anthropology department there, but they kind of got to know, I don't know how much this is a part of it, but they kind of got to know that his political commitments were to anarchism. And anarchism, if you know, is opposed to the state. We don't know yet. You can't come in and just do that. Oh yeah, so David Graeber was at Yale University, and because he was in his everyday life anarchist, he wasn't made professor by them, even though he probably should have, and had to search for jobs elsewhere, and eventually came to Goldsmiths. And then this book was so successful, he was able to get a very prestigious professorial chair, and he gave the Malinowski lecture, the annual lecture in Malinowski's name, and so on. And this book sold really well. It was really successful. Why? Well, partly because the topic was very relevant for international economics, questions of international debt, and whether or not we should so-called forgive the debt of the third world countries that they owe to the IMF. Think about this. Right now, or maybe 10 years ago, now still as well, many countries were so far in debt to the World Bank and the IMF that they couldn't manage the payments. So in that situation, the World Bank wasn't saying you've got to pay it all back. They were saying you've got to manage as much, pay as much as you can. Graeber's argument is that there's no real expectation or even obligation to pay things back, just to stay in the relationship of debt. Right? It's a social relationship. It's a way of locking you into a relationship. And it made it very easy for the World Bank and the IMF to then say, okay, out of generosity, we'll cancel the debts. And you can start from scratch with a clean slate and borrow again. You do borrow again and start paying back again. Right? That was the trick, to continue the social relation. I mean, this is the thing with the banks as well. If you get so far in debt you can't pay back, the bank has no real interest in demanding from you blood from a stone to pay back. They could wipe that debt and start you again on a cycle of lending and paying back, which is more important. In England now, there are these companies that will help you wipe off your debt. You owe £55,000 to the different credit cards and so on. They'll negotiate an arrangement where you pay just a few pounds every month and forget about it, sort of. Because, yeah, the issue is not making sure they squeeze every debt payment back, but having a certain turnover of credit. Because credit is somewhat fictional. Anyway, Graeber's book was about that, but it was also came at the time when 2010 was introducing high fees for university degrees. Now this has some significance. What is the demographic of students and what has happened to their desire to study when the Conservative government, especially concerned in the UK to remove interests and support for the arts or the humanities and those left-wing causes like social science, were cut back. Their funding was cut. And in fact, universities were forced to find their own money to fund programs, and then encouraged by the government to do that by introducing what was called full fees. So what they had introduced originally in the 70s, they had free education. What they introduced then was small fees where each student would pay, you know, like the equivalent of 20 million dong, right? Not that much, still quite a lot, 20 million, but not that much in terms of a year's education. But they were about, in December 2010, they passed legislation to change it from that small amount to £9,000. Anyone good at monetary transfer? What is £9,000 in dong? It is, it's done for 242 per year, 240 million per year, which sounds like, you know, the price of private education at an international school here, yeah? But for a university, that's a lot, especially for a home university student, an English student that previously had only spent 20 per year. That jump is massive, right? And consider they also have to live, this is say a London student, they have to pay this, and the cost of living in London is probably 15,000, which I guess is more like 350. Sure, so 590 just to live as a student. But, and the students protested against this. There were a series of demonstrations. David Graeber and I were at the first one. That was largely my class. But this series of protests outside the parliament culminated in December in the passing of the legislation and disaffection of the students, like real aggressive protests with the police and so on surrounding the parliament. But it's interesting to think, what was it that made the students protest against this in 2010? Because this is for so-called home students, meaning English people and European. But for international students wanting to study in London, since about 8 years, they had already been paying 15 or 13,000 pounds. So they'd also already been paying about 300 plus 350 to live, and to live not well, to live like a student, right? Eating baked beans and not, you know, 650 per year. So a big investment by parents, usually, who send students. You didn't go on your own, because if you're 20 years old and you have that kind of money, why do you go to England? But anyway. But they've been doing that for a number of years, like for 8 years or something. Why in 2010, when the student price went up from 20 to 240 millions, why did the students protest then? Not earlier, when the international students were being charged that much, because it wasn't affecting their hip pocket. They had a hip pocket nerve syndrome, right? You only get involved in politics when it starts to affect you financially if you'd already been turned into a customer, which is what happened at the same time in universities because of globalization. Instead of thinking of the university as a place where we sat around and chat about ideas, what do you think of Hegel and stuff, you know, what do you think of the structure of myth, blah, blah, blah. Universities had turned into training organizations, training people for employment, vocational, and students were paying money to get in there, so they saw themselves as customers buying a service. And it removed actually responsibility in a way. I mean, people thought, right, I'm responsible for spending, not for just thinking, but for getting value for money out of my time. To the point where your time was calculated. You could work out the hours, how much each hour you spent in lectures was worth. And then if you think, if each lecture is worth, say, £135 per hour, the poetry of the spheres or something esoteric like that is a waste of money. It's not helping you with your future career prospect. If you think about some philosophy or something like that, how's that going to get you a job? The logic of that was the problem. It made education into vocational and monetized economic practice rather than a... But 2010 was when the students did protest. I want to relate this to transformations in the way in which anthropology was changing in this context. Changes in the demographic of anthropology as well. The development of global franchise universities. Do you know what I mean by a franchise? Franchise? Okay, so like a franchise university will be, I think you need to know the concept of beverage capitalism, all right? This is going to be fun. Beverage capitalism. Exactly like Starbucks. Okay, it's a little bit different in Vietnam because you actually have your own coffee shops and you're proud of them and they're not going to get turned into everyone will disappear and become a Starbucks. But Starbucks is the franchise, right? It's a model of capitalism based on one startup and you brand it, the color green and a symbol, right? Whatever, right? And then you set up one nearby, that one's got good coffee, right? People like it, they get some loyal customers. You set up another one, those customers also go to that one, and then another one, and then another one, right? You set up a franchise using the same branding, the same coffee, the same publicity. It's cheaper to repeat the formula that's successful than to find another formula, right? And this is common to coffee, but to so many other things, including universities. A franchise university, can you think of one? Yeah, RMIT will do. It's that. No, it's over there. It's over there, yeah. But not just RMIT, also TDTU, right? We're not as big a franchise like them. They are an international franchise because RMIT start in Melbourne and then they come to Barcelona and to Vietnam, and I think they don't have any others. Many others are here in Vietnam, it's true. Fulbright, Greenwich, and others like internationally. You can point to Nottingham who's got a campus in Ningbo in China and Shanghai, Nottingham Trent that got in Peking and so on. But TDT also, right? We've got a campus here, and we've got one in Kamau, and we've got one in Ninh, I think. Nha Trang. Yeah. So we are starting to franchise, right? But it's slightly different when it's in your own country. An international one like Yale University also has Yale Singapore and etc. Yale Beijing, Yale Shanghai, right? So now within that, thinking of universities as a kind of business, on a business model, because these are private university, right, model, and at home they're not a private university. RMIT is not a private university in Australia, but here it is. It's about earning money for, but not just universities, but even disciplines started to think about the franchise, think in the franchise way. And this is actually true since back in Malinowski's day. Malinowski went around the world, he and Radcliffe Brown went around the world setting up anthropology departments in Sydney, in Melbourne, and so on. Or not in Melbourne, it failed. In Sydney, Radcliffe Brown, and other places. But now also, at the same time as you have the critique of fieldwork, you have students turning into customers and demanding different things from their studies. And you had anthropology opening up in ways that were not only franchised to white settler societies like Australia and America, but also starting in Japan and Korea. And then the anthropologists were not all white. They were Indian anthropologists and so on. I mean, way back as well into the 40s and so on, but really established anthropology departments in Singapore and in Vietnam. From 2003, the government said you can start building anthropology departments. This was a part of the attempt to find new ways to do what anthropology did, because its old ways of doing things were ethically questioned, were physically not possible anymore because they didn't have colonial power, were being challenged by the demands of students who said, how does it help me get a job to know about the Nua, right? The tribal group, the Nua. Why should I learn about them? Tell me something more relevant to what I want to do, which is international development work or something. And the context of beverage capitalism, of chain replication of departments, which had the effect of changing the focus of anthropological interest, because an Indian anthropologist doesn't necessarily focus on the same kind of representation of the other kind of project that Malinowski or someone like that might have focused on. All these things happen at the same time and kind of demand that in these new circumstances, which also includes what I call here proletarianization, the decline of the privileged places to make all anthropology projects pretty much the same, routine, not exactly proletarian in our work, but in a way, lowest common denominator, basic intro to anthropology was a common course. These things all happen at the same time to require a different kind of doing anthropology. And in a way, David Graeber's work was one way of trying to do that. Graeber and others were exploring ways to do anthropology differently than it used to be. And they went through the back history of anthropology looking for models for that. So Graeber found it in reading Mauss as a kind of proto-anarchist. He found it in his mentor, Marshall Salins, who did work on Stone Age economics and so on, but who was also the guy who had done the teach-ins around the Vietnam War, the American War, in universities in America. And so the anti-war stuff of the 60s and 70s was being replicated by these anthropologists around 2000, 2003, especially against the Iraq War, and on still in 2010. In a way, the protests of 2010 were the consequences of Stop the War, which is 2003, but maybe even go further back to the anti-globalization movement that Graeber writes about in Direct Action, and before that even the Criminal Justice Bill and the Reclaim the Streets protest movement, which was saying too many streets in the island of England were devoted to cars and roads, no roads movement, and people needed to reclaim that tarmac for people, for social life. So we're talking about this 1960s legacy, knowledge, decolonization, ethics, 1960s and 70s in particular, but then updated in the years 2000 or maybe afterwards, where the version of accepting knowledge as this gift from the state is challenged by a anarchic principle that, you know, maybe we should actually listen to the people involved, find out from them rather than accept the propaganda from the state. This is Tricky Nixon giving a report on, you know, his bombing campaign. Well, actually here he's searching for the bamboo Pentagon, right? What he was afraid of. Somewhere in the forest there was this other Pentagon. So this tradition, Cultural Revolution, teach-ins, Marshall Salins in Michigan, Students for Democratic Society, Civil Rights Movement, right, French May, all of that was a response to the earlier versions of anthropology that were staring at people and then writing books about them. And it had a principle of trying to reconfigure what knowledge was and where it came from. Unfortunately, the first versions of an alternative to anthropology was consultancy for agencies that work in development or in colonial theatres, in neo-colonialism. So I've talked to you about the human terrain system, written by two anthropologists. Where's the book there? There, this book. I've got the slides out of order. The counterinsurgency book I showed a few weeks back, written by two anthropologists as a new way of doing anthropology under contract for the army. Well, not that new, as I think I showed, but the fact that they were prepared to present it as a new kind of relevance is a bit scary. Whereas in the 70s, they kept that sort of stuff secret, covert. They hid it. Now it was openly fascist. That, the Tribal Research Center and funding calls for, I can skip some of this. So now we're at this time where the crisis of representation has happened, flipped the classroom, and it's the influence of these alter-globalization movements that gave some impetus to Graeber's kind of thinking. The fact that people everywhere were mobilizing against international capital was something. Right, so we had anti-criminal justice bill in the UK, 94, 95. The Zapatistas were the first, really. The anti-globalization, worldwide anti-globalization, in a way, some people you could say, although I've been critical of this. To think that it only started here is wrong. But some people said on the 1st of January 1994, the Zapatistas rose up to commemorate the opening of the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Right? The Zapatistas were revolutionaries in Mexico, in Chiapas. And instead of having an anthropologist, Gled Hill, who worked in Guerrero next door, will comment on this, an anthropologist represent their point of view, their advocate. They spoke for themselves, and their leader, Subcomandante Marcos, was a fictional figure, a multiple personality person. Like, there were several people who were Subcomandante Marcos. Well, perhaps, we don't know. For a little while, we thought it was one of our leftist friends who'd gone there, and because the person who spoke as the spokesperson for the Zapatistas was named after Zapata, right? Emilio Zapata, the 1910 Mexican revolutionary hero. The person who spoke for the Zapatistas always spoke behind a balaclava. You could just see their eyes, and was erudite, but also sort of informed by anthropology, and always keen to tell little stories. They had he'd have these dialogues with a kind of cartoon mouse. I can't remember the mouse's name right now. But anyway, this was Subcomandante Marcos and the Zapatistas, and they had mobilized against and risen up against NAFTA, and the Free Trade Agreement was one of the main planks of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank's push for opening of borders for business. Free trade. No new debate there, of course. Free trade debate goes back to the days of Adam Smith. Adam Smith was in favour of free trade against the East India Company that said it should be the only one allowed to trade with India, or to exploit India trade. Adam Smith was, no, it should be an open competition, then the hidden hand of the market will determine things. No. So, NAFTA as a free trade agreement was exactly the opposite of a free trade agreement. There was no free trade involved. What there was freedom for capital to move across borders, but more borders to stop people from moving. Because part of the agreement of NAFTA was to try and halt so-called illegal immigration across the Mexican border. The sort of stuff that now Trump wants to build a wall to stop. He wants to build but not pay for a wall. It's not free trade, it's a free wall. Okay, and some of the other parts of the story, but the globalization movement, the anti-globalization movement, was real globalization, Graeber would say. He'd say it really was globalization because everywhere all over the globe people were protesting against free trade movements, so-called, and their restrictions and the borders that they reinforced. And his direct action ethnography is sitting in lots and lots of meetings writing about the process of building a global movement against global capital. And that was building momentum all through the 90s. There were big protests in Amsterdam, in Sweden. The one in Sweden, someone was killed. In Italy and in Bombay and in Brazil, Rio. But it became a big political movement, but it was kind of undermined by 2001 when the trade towers were hit and blame was able to be put on Islam, and Islam became the enemy, not the communist. And it took a while for the left to reorganize itself. And it sort of did through a small scale model, starting with Stop the War in 2003, but in 2010, at the same time the students were mobilizing, rising up against fees. In 2010 in Tunis, first of all, but then in Tahrir Square in Cairo, there was a beginning of the movement of the squares, the occupation of city squares by masses of people mobilized against both globalization and military power and dictatorship. So in Tahrir Square in Cairo, in Egypt, for months, people gathered every night, built camps, and stayed in the square, lived in the square, occupied the square to prevent control of the city by Mubarak, the dictator's forces. And then it was replicated in other Arab states. It became the so-called Arab Spring. Arab Spring, which wasn't really an Arab Spring, but an Arab sting, to use a friend of mine's phrase. The Arab sting was a way to get people exposed and then bring in NATO to wipe out the opposition forces, as happened when the movement, when the uprising moved to Libya against Colonel Gaddafi, and Gaddafi was executed. And then Syria and the mess that's there. Meanwhile, Stop the War had become like mild criticism of the war, and students lost their enthusiasm, although some of them moved to a thing called Occupy. And it started off with another movement of the squares, occupying Wall Street in New York. And that's where David Graeber really had another dimension. Occupy, not the only group to identify the IMF as a problem, but they really did target the Washington Consensus, IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization, and so on, and challenged them with a radical form of democracy. So they camped at Wall Street and they invented all sorts of horizontal democratic gestures. I say they're gestures because they didn't really challenge. I mean, capitalism has tanks, and they had slogans like, "We are the 99%, right? We're not the 1% that rule the world, the rich oligarchs." It's less than 1%, actually. You think of the top 100 corporations produce 75% of world pollution and own like 112% of world finances. Because of double dipping, it's more than 100%. It's less than 1% that, you know, and we, the public, are more than 99%. They did some democratic gestures, like in a meeting, to have a progressive meeting procedure. Instead of interrupting, you'd wave your hands to show you agreed, or wave them faster to show you very agreed. Or they had what's called the human megaphone. In a very large group, without any electronics, to get everyone to hear the message. The people on the inside of the speaker heard the message once, then they turned around and shouted it out to the people standing a bit further away, who then turned around and shouted it out to the people standing even further away. So it would get repeated 3 times, and by many people at the same time, which reinforced the speaker's message in some way. And the idea was this was a radical democracy, a flat structure that everyone could participate in. Occupy, however, was very middle class and white in New York. So very quickly there emerged a decolonize Occupy movement to say it should happen elsewhere. And Cleveland and other black cities had an Occupy that was very different. And London had an Occupy and a tent university inside London to recognise those teach-ins and so on. Oh, I've got a picture of that. And the idea was to work really against this kind of spectacle society of single-minded thinking, because the society of the World Bank and the IMF and commercialization and so-called free trade was actually one-directional thinking and not even clear thinking, thinking through plastic spectacles. A kind of fascism, as we've seen before. The one guy that would not do the fascist salute in this picture, very powerful. But we are the 1%. It was a slogan, but it didn't have the strength to defeat the World Bank and the IMF. Didn't have the power. Its strategies, the jazz hands, and the human megaphone and other kind of exchange performances became a model of how to do democratic knowledge, fieldwork and sharing. But, you know, the sharing would be inspired, you tell me a story, I'll tell you one back, and so on. A culture of conviviality, but not enough to challenge the enemy who has tanks. But Graeber's argument against Wall Street and its militarism, and this is Graeber, is that by learning together this conviviality and expanding the circle of who is involved in making knowledge, this could be another model for anthropology. We could learn to unlearn the hierarchical model and think of a different kind of anthropology that would challenge the old approaches. And so its reinvention in the last 20 years through workplace inquiry and autonomous inquiries displaced the old intrepid fieldworker with a facilitator of activist discussion and contribution to knowledge. So that Graeber's message would be something like that another research is possible, that we can be inspired by the past texts of anthropology that wanted to talk about change and culture and be aware, but that we also want to live and die by a new kind of ethics. Unfortunately, David passed away far too early, 8 weeks ago, but his books, of which there are about 20 and a couple of new ones coming, his interest in so many issues will keep his name in the spotlight for a while, I hope. Lal Salam.